and being inviolable, Georgia's laws would not operate. Georgia refused to give any cognizance to the treaty and passed a law saying that the Cherokee Indians were subject to Georgian law. When the Cherokee Indians went before the US Supreme Court, surprisingly, the Supreme Court turned them down on the ground of jurisdiction, saying we don't have original jurisdiction because you are a state within a state which is not recognized by us. It can only be between two states. When this happened, undaunted, William Wirt, who was the ex-Attorney General, decided to take up their cause and sent a white preacher called Wooster to go and preach to the Cherokee Indians and defy Georgia law, saying that under the treaty, the moment he was on Cherokee Indian land, Georgia law did not operate. Wooster did that and was arrested and put into jail, which led then to the second major judgment, again by the US Supreme Court, this time in Wooster versus the state of Georgia. That is the white preacher's name against the state of Georgia. This time, Chief Justice Marshall handed down an opinion which said, yes, the treaty is supreme law under Article 6 of the US Constitution, has to be followed not only by the center but the state as well, and that Wooster could not possibly be denied the benefit of Cherokee Indian law, which alone operated, and his arrest therefore was wrongful. Now the president at that point of time was an obdurate general by the name of Andrew Jackson. He is famously reported to have said, Marshall has written his judgment, let him enforce it. And what happened thereafter was a little strange, because Wooster succeeded, but the Cherokee Indians got thrown out. And what happened was that it so happened that another state, South Carolina, started defying federal law within its state and said federal taxes can't be collected in our state. So Jackson then exhorted Congress, who passed what was called the Force Bill at that time, that the military could be sent in order to enforce federal law within a state. What happened was that somehow or the other, Wooster, being a white man, happened to get released. And ultimately, therefore, the Supreme Court judgment was executed. But the whole basis of the judgment was that the Cherokee Indians would not be bound by Georgia law within their territory. President Jackson used this force bill to force these very Indians out of Georgia. And what was described as a vale of tears took these poor people all the way to Oklahoma in breach of a solemn treaty made with the United States. And on the way, in a place called Little Rock in Arkansas, Chief Ross, the Indian chief's wife, died and is buried. And a mile away from where she is buried, another great drama took place, which I'll come to immediately. These two instances have shown us that at least in the early 19th century, the court was indeed a very fragile institution because the executive could with impunity disregard its orders. We now come to the famous US Civil War, which took place as a result of a decision in Dred Scott's case, which most of you people must be knowing about, which was handed down in 1857, the same year as our mutiny, by the US Supreme Court. And ultimately, Dred Scott, a black, was held not to have rights as a human being at all. He was considered property. And the court used Marbury, which was an 1803 judgment in 1857, to strike down yet another act of Congress, which was called the Missouri Compromise, which dealt with free states and slave states. And if a slave somehow got free beyond a certain meridian, he remained free. This, the court said, didn't square with the Fifth Amendment because the slave was property. He was not a human being. It struck it down. All this led to the Civil War. This led to President Lincoln being assassinated. And ultimately, the three great amendments that were passed, 13, 14, and 15, abolishing slavery and granting equal rights. Now, unfortunately, to enforce these amendments also took over a century. Because what happened in between was that you had in several cases, the civil rights cases, slaughterhouse cases, etc., whittled down the scope of the amendment to apply only to blacks first, so that it couldn't apply to other immigrants like the Chinese, for example, who lost a case, and to make it apply only against state action, which meant that private discrimination could continue. It's only the state that couldn't discriminate. Ultimately, in a judgment delivered in 1896, the first Justice Harlan dissenting in Plessy versus Ferguson, they said, we will allow Congress and we will allow the states, this is the Supreme Court said, to have separate but equal facilities, so that there would be no intermingling between the two races. If you set up a school for whites, you should set up an equally good school for blacks, and so on. Now, this continued right till the 1950s after the Second World War. And for the first time, in a very famous case, Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court was again faced with this separate but equal doctrine, so to speak. And the first hearing took place before a Chief Justice, Vinson, who was weak. Fortunately, the case was reheard, and he died in the process of rehearing. So that post-rehearing, it came up before one of the most remarkable Chief Justices, a man called Earl Warren. Macaulay had famously said that in the navy of Charles II, there were seamen and there were gentlemen. The gentlemen were not seamen, and the seamen were not gentlemen. Similarly, you have great judges and you have brilliant judges. Great judges are not necessarily brilliant judges, and brilliant judges are not necessarily great judges. Chief Justice Warren was a great judge, not a brilliant judge, because he had leadership ability, which is what was most required at the time of Brown. So at the second hearing in the Brown case, there were certain Southerners who were plantation owners among the judges who held out and said, no, we think Plessy versus Ferguson is correct. After all, there is equality. Why should the races mix? And it took lunch diplomacy of a very high order for Chief Justice Warren to ultimately bring to his side Justice Clark and Justice Reed. The latter stood out right till the end. So they had a second hearing, and you had a Brown 2, in which, because of Justice Reed and because of Chief Justice Warren's desire that there be a completely unanimous front for this earth-shattering decision, the second Brown case then left it to the federal district courts to desegregate, so that this would not come as a huge shock to the nation all at one time, but would take its time. And the words used were, you will desegregate with all deliberate speed, purposely vague language. Now, the process itself took a long time. But coming back to Little Rock, if you remember, in Arkansas, where the great Indian chief Ross' wife was buried, the school district there, because of the governor, a man called Forbes, refused to desegregate. The federal court, which by the Supreme Court judgment was ordered to see that desegregation took place, specifically sent out an order saying desegregate. Governor said, we will not desegregate. Fortunately, and this was the year 1957, President Eisenhower sent out the 101st Airborne Division, which division consisted essentially of blacks. Symbolically, it was very interesting because it was one of the hardest hit American divisions in the Second World War. having fought the Battle of the Bulge in late December 1944. And 1,000 troops, crack troops of this division, were sent down to enforce that district judge's order. So that by force, in Little Rock, Arkansas, desegregation took place for the year 1957. But that was not the end of the story. The next year, the district board decided to defy the Supreme Court yet again and said, ultimately you have left it to us. We will decide that we will desegregate only after 30 months, 30. So this then led to stage 2, where the celebrated case of Cooper versus Aaron was then taken up, again by Chief Justice Warren in the US Supreme Court. Again in a unanimous, hard-hitting decision, it was stated that if necessary, federal troops should be called out to enforce this order. But the board had the last laugh, because the board then said, we'll take a referendum of everybody in the city. And by an overwhelming majority, the referendum decided, we'll shut down the school. So that we will defy the desegregation order, we'll have nobody, no whites, no blacks. And that obtained for the year 1958, with the Supreme Court sitting helplessly by, until finally in the year 1959, desegregation actually took place under the auspices of both the President and the Supreme Court. And slowly and steadily, the country limped forward till the Civil Rights Acts were passed by Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, piloted, of course, by President Kennedy. Now, all this shows you that the judiciary, having to depend upon the executive for enforcement of its order, was not just an 18th century phenomenon. It went way into the 19th century. Today it's taken for granted. And this brings me to part 2 of my talk. Now that this is taken for granted, is the judiciary the least dangerous branch because of some problem within? The judiciary ultimately is the ultimate bulwark against the government of the time if it misbehaves, in order to support the rights of the people. In times of war, how has the judiciary fared? For this, we'll refer to a couple of First World War and Second World War decisions. We first come to the decision in Hirabayashi's case and Korematsu's case, both US Supreme Court judgments, during the course of the Second World War. All of you know that despite President Roosevelt wanting to enter the war, Congress steadfastly refused. And it took the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on 7th December 1941 to ultimately make Congress declare war on Japan 4 days later. The result of this declaration of war was that in February 1942, President Roosevelt, under the auspices of Congress, issued an executive order, which executive order declared the entire West Coast as a militarized zone and gave powers to the army authorities in that militarized zone to pass orders necessary to combat espionage and sabotage. And the orders passed concerned themselves with US citizens of Japanese ancestry. There were a very large number of them on the West Coast. Now, Fred Korematsu happened to be the grandson of an immigrant Japanese. So, he was a second-generation American, born in the United States. The two orders that were challenged before the Supreme Court, passed by the general, a man called DeWitt, was first an order which was a curfew order, which said that all the Japanese in the West Coast, that is persons of Japanese ancestry, you could go back 3 generations, all of them would have to stay in their homes between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. because, according to the general, it was in the dark hours of the night that espionage and sabotage was at its highest. This was challenged in Hirabayashi's case. And a unanimous Supreme Court said, yes, that's perfectly all right. Because after all, we are fighting a war. There is an imminent threat of invasion. I don't know where they got that from. And because there is this imminent threat, we are not persons who can now step into the shoes of Congress or the executive. They can judge best when there is a world war going on, and therefore hands off. And this curfew order was therefore upheld. But now came a very serious order, an order which was a much more serious infraction in the fundamental right of a US citizen. This order was an externment order, so that persons like Korematsu would now have to leave their homes and be put into concentration camps without any determination of whether they were disloyal, without anything. There was no charge against them, nothing. It was like an order of preventive detention. You are herded into a concentration camp. He defied the order, so he got 5 years jail, apart from the concentration camp, and took his case all the way up to the US Supreme Court. This time by a decision of 6-3. Justice Black, leading the court, otherwise a very great libertarian judge, said, look, there is an imminent threat of invasion, and used the same sort of logic as Hirabayashi, and ultimately said, we are not persons in times of war to get into all these niceties. This is a time of war, therefore, what the executive thinks best is best. But interestingly, 3 judges dissented. The first judge was Justice Roberts, the famous Justice Roberts, whose switch in time saved 9, if you remember. Because Roosevelt wanted to pack the court, because the court was striking down all his New Deal legislation. This Justice Roberts switched at the last time, and 5-4, striking down became 5-4 upholding. And here he spoke with great verve and said there's nothing like an imminent threat at all. This is pure racism. We don't recognize it, and it therefore violates the 14th Amendment and must be struck down. The second judge was an ex-Attorney General, Justice Murphy, who pretty much said the same thing. And the third dissenter was the most interesting judge of all, the great Justice Jackson.